Eurasia Unveiled podcast series brought to you by the Eurasian Research and Analysis Institute.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Erik Khzmalyan, and I'm a director of Eurasia Unveiled podcast series sponsored by Eurasian Research and Analysis Institute. And today it is our 5th episode, and we'll be talking all things Afghanistan today. And I'm beyond delighted to be joined by Brendan Weichert, a subject matter expert. So Brendan Weichert is a former congressional staffer and is the founder and CEO of the Weichert Report, a world news website. He's also a contributing editor at American Greatness. Brendan received his BA in Political Science from DePaul University and his Master's in Statecraft and National Security Affairs from the Institute of World Politics. Again, it is my pleasure to be joined by Brendan today, a man who knows a great deal about Afghanistan and the regional geopolitics. Thank you so much, Brendan, for coming out today.
Well, thank you for having me, Eric, and it's a delight to be here.
So, Brendan, Afghanistan, right? It's such a timely topic, and for centuries, Afghanistan has been a power struggle center for great powers, and of course, the US is not an exception. So, some say that America's primary agenda was getting rid of the Taliban, but also there are a lot of commentators out there that say that America's agenda was also preventing China and Russia from becoming regional hegemons. Do you share this point of view?
Well, I can certainly see how people would think that, and I know that the previous Undersecretary for State, I think for Policy, Victoria Nuland, was WikiLeaks in 2009 leaked a private statement she gave with the British ambassador, which basically said the great game has begun again in Afghanistan, referencing the old battle between Russia and Britain for control over that part of the world. I'm sure that there are many American strategists who want to have a geopolitical stake in Afghanistan for the express purpose of preventing Russia and China from gaining hegemony there. But if you look at what's going on right now, America's position in Afghanistan, I think, is tenuous at best. Meanwhile, even with us being there for the last, 17 years, right, China and Russia are on the ascendance in that region, as is Iran in that country, rather. You have China with their Mess-Aynak copper mines that they're getting involved with all the copper business, taking over all the mines. You have Russia basically paying the Taliban off, taking over greater influence with the Taliban. Iran is also playing heavily with the Shiite diaspora in Afghanistan. So I think our position, if the goal is to reunite the great game with us playing the role of Britain, I worry that is a losing proposition because A, the American people don't want it, and B, I don't think we have the resources to do that kind of operation. Afghanistan is a graveyard of empires, and so we need to be careful to avoid that fate.
Makes sense, absolutely. And since you mentioned Russia and China, what are their respective strategies and ultimate goals in Afghanistan? What are they trying to achieve there?
Well, I think with Afghanistan, let's take them at the two powers there, China and Russia, share with us a desire not to see the rise or return of jihadist forces. It's interesting that both China and Russia at selective times do business and lend support to the Taliban. China, to get access to the copper mines, which are in Taliban-controlled territory, they pay the Taliban off. Russia has been intensifying their connections with the Taliban over the last few years. General Nicholson, who's the commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan a few months ago, testified that the Russians are heavily involved now with the Taliban. So their goal seems to be to prevent the rise of an ISIS-type jihadist network, but to try to create a stable environment. And I think that they're banking on the fact that the Taliban are not going anywhere. The Taliban love to say that Americans have all the watches, but we, the Taliban, have all the time. And I think that's because the Taliban are highly connected with they're of the Pashtun tribal region. They are basically a Pashtun liberation front, as Michael Scheuer, the former CIA bin Laden unit head, likes to refer to them as. So they're not going anywhere per se. And I think that China and Russia want to see America take a step back from Afghanistan ultimately. They don't like that we're operating on their borders, and I think ultimately they just want a stable environment in Afghanistan.
Brandon, recently you wrote an article for the American Greatness, which I very much enjoyed reading. And there you argue that there is only one true solution to Afghanistan, and that is multilateral regional solution. And you even claim that Pakistan has the key to final solution.
Yes.
Can you please elaborate on
Sure.
this?
And I also wrote an article that was at American Greatness that was republished at the Hudson Institute's South Asia blog in February, which I basically said that the way out of Afghanistan, we have to exit Afghanistan by getting India to open the door for us. So basically what I mean by that is the notion that America is going to play this great power, rivalry, the way that Britain did in the last century, I think is absurd. That's not who we are, and that's a lot of resources and money and time and people, I think, that are wasted. We have greater global concerns. So I think that the best solution would be to get the Chinese and the Russians, who have, as I stated earlier, already bought into a stable Afghanistan, try to bring the Iranians on board if at all possible. We can use the Russians to do that. And then the big linchpin, though, is going to be Pakistan. Now, Pakistan has a vested interest in maintaining Afghanistan as strategic depth in their fight against India. Afghanistan has, for decades, since the 80s at least, supported the Taliban and at various times Al-Qaeda operating in Afghanistan because they want to keep India off balance. They don't want India to basically box them in, and that's one way they're able to do that. Inter-Service Intelligence Bureau, which is ISI, which is the Pakistani intelligence service, their mid-level people all support. They try to find ways to support the Taliban, even as their upper echelons of the Pakistani government don't necessarily want to. It's because they want strategic depth against India. Also because of the jihadist factor, there are many conservative Muslims in Pakistan running the show who are sympathetic toward at least the Taliban's worldview of a more conservative Islam being practiced, and they don't like the West having that kind of influence so close to their borders. But you're never going to get them on board directly. You have to use their fear of India against them. We need India anyway. If you look at what's going on with a rising China for American grand strategy, the biggest threat of the next 20 or 30 years is not Russia, it's not Afghanistan, it's China. Or I should say, rather, the big competitor. It's not fair to really say they're a direct threat, but they're a rising competitor that could become a threat at any moment, China is. India is on the soft underbelly of China. And as we've seen until a few weeks ago, there was the Doklam battle going on between India and China. And so we need India anyway. They're a fellow democracy, they're a rising economy, vibrant population, a great people, and they could be used as a potential lever against China on the world stage. We can also, in building that new relationship, say, hey, look, we need your help to get Pakistan to force the situation in Afghanistan to come to a peaceful resolution. And so I think that the multilateral diplomatic solution is the way to go. It's going to be messy. It's not going to end the way I think many American leaders want it to end, with a resounding military victory for the United States.
Correct.
But that's the way that we have to go, is a diplomatic multilateral route. So,
well, that puts a lot of things into perspective. So thanks for breaking
Thank
it
you.
down for us. So just going back to China and Afghanistan, it's no secret that they're heavily involved there, including militarily. Where does Afghanistan exactly fall in China-Pakistan economic corridor? How CPAC sort of forces China to more actively engage in Afghanistan?
Well, yeah, at the basic level, it's important because, I mean, as you've written for the Weichert report, articles on the new Silk Road that China's developing,
Right.
which is linking all of Eurasia together in this land-based trade route. Afghanistan is going to play a role in that just because of their proximity geographically. And so Afghanistan's important. More importantly, though, setting aside trade, the real important thing for China, as I noted earlier, is stability on their western border. They have the Xinjiang province, which is where most of the Muslims living in China reside, the Uyghurs, and they are a highly restive population. And so what you're seeing is China is conducting patrols in Afghanistan alongside both the Afghan National Police, and they're even doing deals and working with the Taliban, depending on which part of Afghanistan they're working in. And the reason is because they are very interested in keeping back any jihadist element. It's a security thing. It's about stability for their western periphery, which they are very worried about because, I mean, up until recently, if memory serves, I believe The Diplomat did a whole series on this in 2010 or 2011. Xinjiang was basically under martial law. under lockdown because the Muslims were so restive there. They don't want to be part of China. Who would want to be part of China if you're a practicing believer of a faith? Chinese Communist Party, they crack down on everyone from the Falun Gong to Christians for practicing faith, and the same is true for Muslims.
Brandon, going back to Russia, Russian authorities on many occasions have condemned America's military presence. However, others say that American presence for Russians has been a blessing. Ultimately, what's happening, Taliban is getting tired of American presence and they're eventually shifting towards Russia. And one would be right to claim that eventually they will embrace Russia's strategic vision for Afghanistan. What do you have to say on this?
Well, I would say that that's a great assessment. I think that's 100% correct. That's, I think, what the Russians are hoping for. I mean, I don't know if you saw it, but the Oliver Stone interviews with Putin, I thought was, as I said in my lecture here on Russian foreign policy in their East, the Oliver Stone interview was a French kiss to Putin, but it did give us a great insight into, I think, how Putin views the world.
All right.
When he's happy, I get a little concerned. Now, I'm also of the mind that we have to deal with Putin. That's just the way the world works.
Right.
But I'm skeptical. But with Putin, when he says that he's touting his help for America, over the last 17 years in Afghanistan, that tells me that it's because he thinks that there's a win there for him. And I think what we in the States have to figure out or have to get used to is that we're no longer in the Cold War. It's no longer a zero-sum mentality. If Putin wants to have the Taliban, I say give it to him. Like I said, we're not, this notion that we're going to destroy the Taliban. Well, unfortunately, they are an ethno-religious reality of Afghanistan. They're not like Al-Qaeda, which were foreign. They were basically Arabs that came in. I think that the thing with Afghanistan is that Al-Qaeda was very much a foreign movement from the Arabian Peninsula, just looking for refuge in Afghanistan. The Taliban, though, are a different story entirely. They are indigenous. And while they certainly don't have a majority support of the people in Afghanistan, they have a large degree of support from predominantly the Pashtuns, and which is one of the largest ethnic groups in the country. It's a storied past. And so the notion that we're going to get rid of the Taliban through force of arms, it's just not the way that's going to go. But that's not the way we're fighting. We're not fighting that kind of war, and that's not the kind of war America normally fights. War of extermination. That's not what we're into, understandably. So we want to defeat the Taliban, obviously, but I don't think it's going to end in the way that World War II ended. For instance, it'll be a negotiated settlement. And so Russia, back to the multilateral issue, Russia is going to play a role in that. And actually, I'm fine with that. Look, Russia ultimately has to live with Afghanistan in their backyard, and so we don't. And our goal is to basically, to use American football term, is to play prevent defense, which is to basically just prevent Afghanistan from going back to the terror hotbed that it was before 9/11. Well, Russia and China both share that goal. In fact, one of the reasons that Russia is getting more involved with the Taliban is because they were trying to split the Taliban away from making a new deal with the rising ISIS Khorasan element, ISIS-K, in Afghanistan. And so that, while Russia is willing to do business with the Taliban, they don't want to see the rise of the new ISIS elements. They don't want to see the return of Al-Qaeda. And so I think that really we can work. Again, there's a deal to be had. It's not perfect. It's not as nice as working with Britain. There are different cultural norms, different strategic objectives overall, but specifically, Russia wants stability on their border. China wants stability on their border. Those are the two powers to get, along with India, to put the pressure on Pakistan. And by the way, through Russia and even China, you can put pressure on Iran, who will also in turn put pressure on Pakistan.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
To force about a resolution. The goal for us, not let Al-Qaeda return or not let Afghanistan become the terror hotbed it once was. We can do that with what former Vice President Joe Biden was pushing. And now, of course, I may not share his political worldview, but I think he was right on this, which was the counterterrorism plus strategy, which basically we pull most of our forces out and leave only special forces and CIA paramilitary teams, as well as defense contractors, to basically conduct strictly counterterrorism operations, no nation building, no counterinsurgency the way we've been doing it, very low cost, high reward. And then we at the same time with the CIA folks, we bribe the local tribes and get them on our side. That's how Afghanistan works. The old British axiom: you can't buy an Afghan, but you can rent one. And we did this, and I noted this in one of my articles at American Greatness. We did this in 2001 to spring 2002. We were quite proficient in bribing the locals to turn on al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and with a very small force of special forces and CIA paramilitaries, as well as indigenous actors, the Northern Alliance, we toppled the Taliban and al-Qaeda. That was the way you win in Afghanistan. That's how you fight in Afghanistan. Everyone from Alexander the Great to Babur, the founder of the Mughal dynasty, the British 3 times, the Soviets in the 1980s. All these forces went in with heavy forces, and they had mixed results, to say the least.
Great rundown of the events in the region, Brendan. Thank you. So, of course, speaking of Afghanistan, we can't obviously ignore one of the most powerful actors in the region, and of course, I'm referring to Iran.
Yes.
What's their game plan?
Well, their game plan is they don't want to be sandwiched in by American forces. So, I don't know if this was what they were thinking in the former George W. Bush administration, but one of the few highlights of the otherwise disastrous Iraq War was the logic that, hey, if we go in to Iraq, we've got forces in Afghanistan, we have forces in Iraq, we are now effectively sandwiching in Iran, which is the mothership of terrorism, and we can really start to put the squeeze on them. In fact, one of my professors at DePaul, Khalil Murar, he wrote an article, this was back in 2009 or 2010, jokingly referring to the America's grand strategy as exiting Iraq through Iran. And so, no, we never did that. And that's probably for the best, because at the time we could not have, and I'm a big fan of trying to do more realpolitik and less neoconservative,
right.
flights of fancy. But I understand the strategic logic in that. So Afghanistan, so I think Iran was certainly very petrified when we went into Iraq, because they were looking at our people in Afghanistan and they knew we weren't going anywhere for a while. And they were looking at our people in Iraq and they're saying, they could start to pivot. In fact, in 2003, after the fall of Saddam, when the statue came down, I remember there was a lot of talk from people that I knew I have family members who were in military intelligence. There a lot of talk about get ready because we're going to swing to Iran. Never happened because we got bogged down.
Wow.
There's a great PBS Frontline from 2007 Showdown with Iran, which goes through what the National Security Council at the time was talking about doing. And it was quite frightful in terms of the amount of resources they were going to commit to this endeavor in Iran. It never came about. Probably for the best again. I don't know. But so Iran's goal in Afghanistan is they in a way have gotten us out of Iraq to a point. They've extended the Shiite diaspora through Iraq into the Levant. Now they are saying, let's try to get America out of Afghanistan. And so there's a huge Shiite diaspora there. They've been receiving funds and support from Iran. And I think Iran's ultimate goal is to see America's position in Afghanistan, if not completely reduced, then certainly slightly reduced. And we, up until 2 weeks ago when President Trump announced the new strategy, which isn't really new, we had 8,400 troops, give or take, operating in Afghanistan. After the surge, we're going to have about 15,000. That's still nothing compared to the height of our presence there, which had over 100,000 guys. And so I think Iran's whole purpose in Afghanistan long term is to basically just push us out or to see us go. And unfortunately, unless we're willing to commit the kind of resources, I mean, we're already spending $1 trillion after 17 years. We've lost thousands of people. I don't know if that kind of commitment is worth it, especially when you look at it and you go, there are other things we can do to keep Iran or put Iran back in its box. And we're already starting to do that with building up the Arab Sunni and Israeli alliance with Saudi Arabia, which was the president's trip to Saudi Arabia back in, I think, April, when he did the big arms deal. And it seems like we're trying to rebuild the old alliance system that used to dominate in the Middle East to contain Iran, the kind of alliance system that died, frankly, when we destabilize the region by invading Iraq. And so that's the Iranian goal in Afghanistan, is get us out. But we're going to have to leave anyway because it's too far from home, and I don't really know. And again, I'm for keeping counterterrorism elements there, but in terms of the big American presence that we're there to prop up the central government in Kabul, it's not worth it.
Interesting. Brandon, I think you would agree with me that to a degree we did a big favor to Iran in terms of undermining the Taliban significantly and toppling Saddam's regime. So we really gave a lot of tool to Iran to become a regional power. What do you have to say on this?
They didn't do anything either. They didn't have to lift a finger to do anything. Iran was completely contained until 2003. We had them totally in the box. Of course, they were flirting with trying to get nukes, and certainly that's always going to be a concern. But in terms of geopolitically, they were mostly in their box. And then we decided to go on our merry jog through the desert in Iraq, and our fighting men and women performed beyond admirably, and they achieved a historic victory in toppling Saddam, a humanitarian victory in toppling Saddam. But unfortunately, the knock-on effects kind of negated the victory in toppling that madman Saddam. And with the Taliban as well, you're right. We have basically become Iran's proxy. I remember when I was working on the Hill that we were talking a lot about at the time the Syrian intervention, or whether we're going to do it or not. And I remember all the U.S. troops holding up the signs, we didn't join the U.S. military to become al-Qaeda's air force in Syria. Well, at the same time, I'm thinking, I don't know how many of our peoples joined the military to become Iran's army, which is what we were for about at least a decade in the Middle East. And it's unfortunate because the best we got out of that was an empowered Iran, which then doubled down on their nuclear ambitions. And the previous Obama administration then did this ham-fisted, haphazard, insufficient, frankly, executive deal with Iran over their nuclear program, which apparently we are not quite certain if they are following through or not, as the President Trump said that they are living up to the letter of the deal, but not the spirit. But to me, that sounds like diplomatic talk for saying they're not doing what they're supposed to do after we've done all of this for them, wittingly or not. And so you're right. If I could use one word to describe our experience in the Middle East since 2003, really, I would use the word tragedy or tragicomic. Wow. Because it's we've tried to do the right thing the very wrong way. And I know it's easy to say 20/20 hindsight, but to be fair, there were many people at the time who were saying these things, who were trying to warn both inside the George W. Bush and then later the Obama administration about don't do Iraq, do focus on Afghanistan, and then with Obama, don't do Libya. If you're going to do Syria, you got to do it early when there are still actual moderate forces on the ground that we can prop up. By the time we were talking of intervening in 2013, when the chemical weapons became an issue, there was no such thing as a moderate. In fact, I don't even know if there ever was a moderate as we understand it. Dr. Linchowsky, who's the founder of IWP, I remember sitting in one of his classes when I was here a few years back, and he said that, he was saying that he knew people who had been in the foreign policy establishment for decades who were saying, we have no business getting involved, period. Reagan pulled us out of Lebanon after Iranian proxies bombed our Marine barracks there for the express purpose that Reagan did not want to see us get in the middle of a intercommunal, tribal, religious war in Lebanon, which is now the same thing going on in Syria.
Very unfortunate. Brandon, there are a lot of pundits out there that sort of put forward a very controversial solution, and that is partition of the country.
Yeah.
And they claim that geographically it doesn't make sense to have a unified Afghanistan. There are 4 centers, and they're divided by rugged mountain range. And each of these cities have more in common with their neighboring countries than with each other. For instance, Herat, the western city in Afghanistan, has more in common with Iran than with Kabul per se. Yeah. What's your take on this?
Well, Peter Thompson's epic book on Afghanistan, and I'm forgetting the name now, I believe it was just called Afghanistan, was a history of the tribes and of the different ethno-religious groups that exist in Afghanistan. And you're certainly right, and those pundits are right to point out the 4 divisions, the big divisions and whatnot. But there's one unifying theme throughout Afghanistan's history. And the first two, they're related. The first is that Afghanistan is always at war with itself. There's not a period in time when there was real peace existing in that country. The second most important thing is when they weren't fighting each other, they were temporarily aligning with each other in order to fight perceived foreign intervention. They don't want foreigners telling them how to live their lives, how to run their country, establish their country, set the political boundaries, whatever. The pundits are right to point out that the center of the country is not and has never been Kabul. It is the tribe. And that's because there's no infrastructure in the country. I remember I read the interview that Petraeus gave in 2009 with Foreign Policy. I've also met Petraeus at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. I remember I don't remember when I met him or it was in the article that he said this, but it was one of those two instances where he was talking about Afghanistan and they were asking him about would what we did in Iraq, this was back in 2009, 2010, would what we did in Iraq work in Afghanistan? Of course, he was supporting that, but he did say that the issue is infrastructure. There's one major highway in Afghanistan, Highway 1, which incidentally was built by Americans during the Eisenhower administration, but it's been beaten in all of the major wars they've had in Afghanistan. It's a shattered mess, and it's basically a road to nowhere. And he said that where Highway 1 ends, the Taliban begins, which basically means at that time the Taliban were controlling almost half the country. They've lost. They have, I think about 30 to 40% now of the country. But the point is, there's no unification in Afghanistan. So the pundits are right to point out the divisions. Where I think they're wrong, and if we are going to do a partition, I think a partition geographically would work better in Afghanistan than most other places where they've talked about partitioning, like Libya or Iraq. But I still think partition is a very bad idea. It will destabilize the entire region at a time when we're trying to create stability. And so my thought would be, instead of partitioning, we should be focusing all of that aid and all of the kind of the quote-unquote nation building that we're doing, instead of propping up what is a kleptocratic, and I'm not a member of our government, so I can say this, a kleptocratic, corrupt regime in Kabul that is completely feckless and ineffective. We could be spending at least half of that money by propping up the indigenous tribe, the local actors, building, whatever we need to do to help them. And we can get, by the way, for 20% of the cost of what we're doing, instead of having American troops doing it, we can get the contractors to do it and bring some of our troops home, some of our regular forces. That, to me, empowering local tribes I'm fine with. Partition, though, is very worrisome because of the kind of destabilization it would cause.
Interesting. Brandon, in your article in American Greatness, you also have a policy recommendation for U.S. government, let me put it this way, where you sort of break down the strategy that would help us to leave the country without creating any chaos on the ground.
Sure.
Can you please sum it up for our listeners?
Well, and it was basically a hybrid of what Biden was talking about when he was in office, which was the CT plus strategy, keeping only a large number of U.S. Special Forces, of CIA paramilitaries, and then also a part that I added in was part of the Erik Prince, who was the founder of Blackwater, and he's now, I think it's called the Frontier Services Group, is his new company, does the same thing that Blackwater did basically. He wrote a series of op-eds in the weeks leading up to the recent administration's announcement for Afghanistan, saying, hey, look, instead of sending more American troops, why don't you just intensify the presence of defense contractors to do what the American troops are doing in terms of training up Afghans, helping to build the schools and all that other, that nation building kind of stuff. And I thought that hybrid of the CT plus and the Prince strategy, we've already got about 25,000, give or take, defense contractors operating in Afghanistan. Of course, they have a checkered path. I understand that there is a lot of problems there, but I'm looking at this from that kind of realpolitik, America First perspective, not isolationist, but the notion that we have to look at dollars and cents and lives. How many lives are we willing to lose in this fight, and how much money are we willing to spend, and how much time are we willing to waste, frankly, there trying to make Afghanistan into Arizona? I think that a cheaper strategy would be what I said earlier, which is basically a prevent-defense strategy for Afghanistan, where we just hold the line there, empower local tribes, ignore Kabul, and keep hitting Al Qaeda and Taliban and other ISIS elements when we see them.
Brandon, thank you so much for the illuminating discussion. I learned a lot. I'm pretty sure our listeners learned a lot too. Thank you so much for effectively breaking down everything for us and explaining the picture in the region and what regional powers are trying to achieve. Thank you so much again, ladies and gentlemen. Today I was joined by Brandon Weichert. Brandon is a former congressional staffer and is the founder and CEO of the Weichert Report, a premier journal of geopolitics. Definitely go ahead, check out all the great articles that are being published there. You'll learn a great deal, I promise you. Brandon, again, thank you so much for coming out.
Happy to do it.